Perspectives on Left Politics. On the development of anti-Leninist conceptions of socialist politics. Watch me pronounce this name. Diethard Behrens. Introductory comments. The history of the failure of the Soviet Union is today interpreted as that of socialism. The crimes of Stalinism throw their shadows backward over Lenin, Trotsky, and even Marx. This is, however, only an inversion of that interpretation that had previously viewed the history of the Soviet Union since the Russian Revolution as a history of success connected with the name of Lenin. In both cases, socialism is identified with the events of the Russian Revolution and with Lenin's political theoretical conceptions. Two footnotes here. First footnote. Thus Kolakowski, for example, also reads the writings of the Social Democrats through Leninist lenses, which drives him towards an apology for Stalinism. Characteristic of Lenin, he insists, is the instrumental evaluation of theories, the inquiry into their quo bono, how do you fucking say that, sui bono, for the revolution. Like many others, he remains caught in Leninist apology. Second footnote. For a critique of Leninist notions of economy and politics after 1917, see Diethard Behrens and Cornelia Hafner. Auf der I ain't reading all that. Basically, just read it in Paul Maddox's Anti-Leninist Marxism. This is what I think it's saying in German. Lenin's theoretical reflections are advanced as the legitimation of socialist politics. But it was quickly asked, what kind of revolution was this? What kind of politics was this? From what perspective was left politics from then on to be thematized? Since the 1920s, there has been a broad discussion about the character of this revolution and about the significance and efficacy of Lenin's politics. This discussion was not without influence on the perspectives from which left politics were henceforth thematized. Historical considerations. Until the beginning of the war in 1914, Lenin espoused German social democracy, with Karl Kautsky as theoretical authority, just as Plekhanov was the theoretical political point of reference for the young Lenin up until the founding of Iskra. Conceptually, Lenin felt closest to the middle faction, the Marxist center of social democracy, which led him also to a mechanistic understanding of capitalism and revolution, aimed only at the abolition of the relations of production extrinsic to society. Footnote. Quote, footnote 1, quote, Lenin, on the other hand, is more closely bound to the theoretical tenets of those against whom he struggled politically. In his analysis, his theory is built on the economic foundations of the theoreticians of the Second International. That was a quote from Ulysses Santamaria and Elaine Manville. The next footnote. This ordering of the factions still holds even if one pushes the Marxist center out of the middle and characterizes it as the moderate left of social democracy. See Santamaria and Manville, Lenin. For Lenin, the main economic goal remained the increase of the forces of production and of worker productivity, and his political goal was a better administration. His notion of state capitalism included the maintenance of capitalist forms. On this see Santa Maria and Manville. As late as 1905, end of footnotes. As late as 1905, in the Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution, Lenin still insisted on the identity of his politics with that of August Bebel and Karl Kautsky. This has several implications. In What is to be Done of 1902, an essay that was conceived for the Second Party Conference of the Social Democratic Labour Party of Russia in London in 1903, Lenin leaned on Kautsky, emphasized the claim of the Social Democratic Party to develop socialist insights. These had to be brought to the workers from the outside. The party was endorsed as the, quote, vanguard and organizer, leader and ideologue of the workers, end quote. That's from Kolakowski, not Lenin. Or it's Lenin cited in Kolakowski. The party was endorsed as the vanguard, organizer, leader, and ideologue of the workers. For Kolakowski, as well as for historians of the worker movement who use a similar interpretive schema, what fails to be acknowledged is, first of all, that Lenin's proximity to Kautsky also included Kautsky's evolutionism, as well as his proximity to Plekhanov included the latter's mechanical materialism. Footnote. Engels had, of course, already prepared the way for the narrowing of the dialectic. Second footnote. In Plekhanov's works, the most varied interpretations of materialism are slipped in so that mechanical materialism and dialectical method coincide. Secondly, Kautsky's high esteem for scientific socialism vis-a-vis the workers brings to the fore not only a simple vanguardist conception, but therewith also a privileging of the socialist intellectuals, only a short distance from Ferdinand Lassalle's notion of social czarism, which provides the intellectuals with dictatorial powers. The functions accorded to intellectuals should thus be taken over by the party. Organizationally, this presumption became the foundation of the model of democratic centralism. Not the least consequence of this was the division of Russian social democracy into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Kolakowski emphasizes that three of Lenin's innovations vis-a-vis the traditional conception of Marxism of the Second International were decisive for the success of the Bolshevik Revolution. 1. The alliance of the proletariat with the peasantry. 2. The recognition of the national question. And 3. The special role of the, quote, party as opposed to the spontaneous workers' movement, end quote. That is, as Lenin would say, against the workers' trade union consciousness. The first point, according to all accounts in the more recent literature, proves to be an adaptation of the Narodnik program, one that was taken up only very late by the Bolsheviks and remains determined by power politics. The second point, the question of national self-determination, did indeed play a role in the alliances made during the Russian Revolution. The question of national self-determination emerges, however... Misread. The second point, the question of national self-determination did indeed play a role in the alliances that made during the Russian Revolution. It emerges, however, that what really mattered was the development of the conditions of national sovereignty, the constitution of bourgeois society, the establishment of a domestic market, and participation in the world market. All of this contains within itself a force that, in the long run, serves to jettison socialist ideology. Thus, only the third point remains as a matter of debate: Lenin's conception of the party, that is criticized by both anti-socialist and socialist opponents of Lenin as the essential feature of socialism in its Soviet form. Early critique of Lenin. The earliest and most advanced critique of Lenin's position, dating from the period before the First World War, comes from Rosa Luxemburg. She repeatedly criticized Lenin's political insistence on Bolshevik autonomy vis-a-vis the other factions of Russian and Polish social democracy. Footnote. In one of her motions to the International Bureau of the Second International, Rosa Luxemburg demanded the reunification of the Russian Social Democratic Party and criticized Lenin's divisive tactics. She was referring to the exclusion of the Mensheviks at the Party Congress of 1912 and thus to the constitution of the Bolshevik Party. In her contribution, and a footnote, in her contribution, Organizational Questions of Russian Social Democracy, her answer to Lenin's one step forwards, two steps back, Luxemburg developed a critique of ultra-centralism, which she considered to be the legacy of the Jacobin Blankist party type. Mad footnotes here. See if any of them are worth reading aloud. 2 just random citations. Rosa Luxemburg. The Central Committee is in this formulation the real active core of the party. All other organizations are only instruments. While Luxemburg's notions aimed at a self-centralism of the masses, Lenin's is rather bureaucratic and hierarchical. The critique that Rosa Luxemburg raised in her article on the Russian Revolution is that this centralism would lead to the rule of a group over the population, to the rule of a new elite, to a bourgeois dictatorship. An example of the Here Rosa Luxemburg criticized the position held not only by Lenin that social democracy was the heir to the Jacobins. Footnote. Lenin had written, quote, "The Jacobin who is inseparable from the organization of the proletariat, who has become conscious of his class interest, that is precisely the revolutionary social democrat." In his, quote, anti-critique, Lenin said that not he but Axelrod had declared this. He himself had mentioned that the comparison is only admissible in terms of the difference between the revolutionary and opportunistic wings, between the Jacobins and the Girondins. Or Girondins. I forget how you pronounce that one. Rosa Luxemburg's concern was to emphasize the difference, that's the end of the footnote. Rosa Luxemburg's concern was to emphasize the difference between social democratic and Blankist centralism. Social democracy has no group of the population opposite to itself that could be directed. Accordingly, she criticized as an illusion Lenin's formulation of the fundamental problem as the struggle against a virulent opportunism, which he intended to defeat by means of organizational statutes. Footnote. Okay, those footnotes aren't necessary to read. Return, end of footnotes. The proletariat and the intelligentsia cannot be assigned to the opposite poles of class consciousness and opportunism. Footnote. Quote, above all, it must be said that in the strong development of the inborn capacities of the proletariat towards social democratic organization, and in the suspicion of the academic elements of the social democratic movement, there is not yet anything that can be called Marxist revolutionary. Rather, such notions can easily be shown to be related to opportunistic positions. End quote. That's Rosa Luxemburg. End of footnote. Whether the intelligentsia acts opportunistically, that depends on the historical circumstances. In Russia, the situation is not unambiguous. The theory of, quote, going to the people, as well as to that of the, quote, pure proletariat, are first of all ideological moments, the one developing through agrarian romanticism, just as the other espouses industrial romanticism. Footnote. For Rosa Luxemburg, Russia stood before not a proletarian, but a bourgeois revolution. End of footnote. The questions of organization and of the struggle against opportunism cannot be linked in such an immediate and direct manner. Rosa Luxemburg, argued on the one hand, that opportunism is indeed flexible, but on the other hand, that it is better served in centralized and socially oriented organizations. Footnote. Quote. This is from Rosa Luxemburg. To attribute to opportunism, as Lenin does, an enthusiasm for some specific form of organization, let us say decentralization, is to mistake its nature. But if we understand opportunism, as did Lenin, as the attempt to tame the independent revolutionary class movement of the proletariat in order to make it serviceable to the bourgeois intelligentsia's desire for power, then this purpose cannot best be reached in the beginning stages of the workers' movement through decentralism, but precisely through the rigid centralization that delivers the still immature proletarian movement head and tail to a handful of leaders. End quote. For this reason, end of footnote. For this reason, opportunism cannot be held at arm's length by means of organizational statutes and, quote, ultra-centralism. Even if, quote, opportunism appears to be a product of the workers' movement itself, end quote, and as quote, an unavoidable moment of its historical development, end quote, and immaturity, this needs to be understood quite differently from and in distinction to Lenin's conception. Footnote. It, quote, seems to be an all the more curious idea right at the beginning of the workers' movement to be able to forbid the emergence of opportunistic tendencies through this or that formulation of organizational statutes. The attempt to defend against opportunism with such paper means will actually cut in the flesh, not of opportunism, but of social democracy itself. Such an attempt weakens the ability to resist not only opportunistic tendencies, but also the existing social order. The means turns against its own end. End quote. That's Rosa Luxemburg, I'm pretty sure. Against the, quote, evaluated majesty of a central committee, end quote, other means must be emphasized. Quote, in this way, the audacious acrobat overlooks the fact that the only subject to whom this role as pilot falls is to the mass of the working class, that always insists on making its own mistakes in order that it may itself learn the historical dialectic. Finally, we must say openly among ourselves, missteps that a truly revolutionary workers' movement makes are immeasurably fruitful historically and more valuable than the infallibility of the very best Central Committee. End quote. End of footnote. The question of organization then came to the fore as one of the central problems in the discussion of the old social democracy and in the new organizational formations that emerged in the labor movement at the beginning of the 20th century. For this movement, too, the organization, its genesis, and its form became the focus. If working people were to be organized through a central committee, then the structure and relations of dependence, as well as ingrained conceptions of authority, remain in place. How then, under these conditions, could a socialist consciousness emerge, that is, a consciousness capable of understanding and transforming social relations? How should a consciousness of socialism, as a vision of the abolition of all enslaving and alienating relations, assume its place? Organization, as Rosa Luxemburg rightly emphasized, cannot be presupposed. Jesus Christ. Organization, as Rosa Luxemburg rightly emphasized, cannot be presupposed in an a priori fashion. It cannot be conceived in abstraction from existing social relations. In short, organization cannot be presupposed to existing social relations, but is always a form of political social cooperation. The peculiar form of social democracy developed from the results of the 1848 revolution. It emerged from a historical context in which social relations had not fully developed in capitalist terms. For Luxemburg, this should give us pause for thought and cause us to think through the organizational question anew and better. The worry that a political stance adapts itself to the currently most favorable relations and is always ready, as it were, to sacrifice fundamental principles to a favorable opportunity, mostly an opportunity for individual advance, is not rendered obsolete in centralist models of organization. In these centralist models of organization, there is even more room for such opportunistic behavior, and opportunism is not limited to the intellectuals either. Lenin acknowledged this with his thesis on the labor aristocracy. Nevertheless, the differentiation between unskilled and skilled labor is also quite inadequate as a conceptual means of explaining opportunism. Class membership says nothing about the content. Class membership says nothing about the content. Certainly, opportunistic elements can also be found among different leadership groups. Centralism appears as the simple flip side of opportunism. Footnote: Russian Social Democratic centralism is also the legacy of the structure of their respective societies, Wilhelmianism and Tsarism. Talk of opportunism rather obscures the problem that people in their existing social contexts are not only antagonists but also contemporaries, that they are not only workers but also participants in the sphere of circulation. If simple models of organization are abandoned, then we open the way to focusing on the forms of conflict in which working people are involved and on the experience that workers make in the course of their struggle. This is where the consciousness of the possibility of socialism is formed. From a socialist perspective, the characteristics of Soviet power, summed up in the formula of state capitalism and electricity, do not provide alternatives to bourgeois society. Lenin formulated his politics on the basis of the autonomously conceived social relations of production and the forces of production, where the social relations of production stands for capitalism and the forces of production stand for socialism. This formulation alone indicates that capitalism was not understood. The unfettering of productivity, already recognized by Marx in the Communist Manifesto, is a progressive moment of the capitalistic dynamic. Notwithstanding the few indications provided by Rosa Luxemburg, the debate about what is unfettering could mean from a socialist perspective has hardly begun. This section summarizes workers' movement and emancipation. This section summarizes briefly the history of the left opposition within and on the edge of social democracy, and thus provides the prehistory of the opposition to Leninism. Before 1914, German social democracy was the strongest party within the European workers' movement. German social democracy's beginnings lay in the results of the 1848 revolution, the concentration and organization of the growing worker population, and opposition against the emerging Wilhelmian society and state. Its main strength lay in the organization of the, quote, journeyman among the artisanry and industry. Footnote. The party focused on skilled workers as its industrial basis, and this continued to be the case well beyond the First World War. End of footnote. This had a formative side, social formation of the skilled workers, and a status or guild-like side, warding off the lower social layers denounced as, quote, lumpen proletariat. Footnote. This estate terminology was taken over by the Leninist tradition. End footnote. Politically, social democracy also functioned as a focal point for a part of the bourgeois opposition. Social democracy inherited the main legacy of, quote, democratic Germany, even if the understanding of democracy became increasingly disputed. The, quote, socialist laws led both the party and its followers to a certain radicalization that after the repeal of those laws, both the party and the unions were relieved to abandon. This was also the moment of the emergence and formation of the left opposition that formulated its demands as, quote, social emancipation, end quote, self-determination and democracy. 5 factions of this left opposition can be differentiated, which appear partially in historical sequences and partially contemporaneously. The first group, the so-called young ones, German anarchism of the fin de siècle, do not know how to pronounce that, fin de siècle, turn of the century, whatever is that, please help me, anarchist syndicalism. The next group were just the Syndicalist. The third, the Rosa Luxemburg faction. The fourth, the radical intellectuals, Julian Borchardt, Heinrich Laufenberg, Karl Liebnik, Franz Pfeffert, Fritz Wolfheim, and the Bremen radicals, Anton Pannekoek, Neef, Gorder. The opposition of the young ones. German anarchism. After the repeal of the socialist laws and the beginning of the new politics, left Social Democrats, partly those who had led the opposition to the socialist laws, began to resist politics of the party and the unions. The social democratic opposition can be differentiated from that within an anarchistic profile. In the context of these conflicts with the leadership of the party and the unions, the faction of the young ones was formed. They too were anti-parliamentary, anti-centralist, and opted for a federalist union movement. A further target of their criticism was the increasing bureaucratization in the party and union movement. They also criticized the reform course of the party as mere adaptation, the politics of balancing between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat in the unions, the adoption of the leadership principle in place of the democracy principle in the party organization. As a consequence, a large number of young ones were forced out of the party and the unions. Footnotes. See Bach's Syndicalismus. These revolts were also supported by Demela F. Nieuwenhuis. As shown in by Nieuwenhuis's Politcs, there was quite an opportunity for integration. The lack of a capacity for integration can often be seen in the history of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. Engels, on the other hand, denounced the movement as a rebellion of literati and students, which ignores the fact that they were anchored amongst the workers in the large cities. Second footnote. As a reaction to the exclusion of parts of the opposition, the Vereinigung ohne Bangiger Socialisten was founded with the journal Socialist as its publicity organ. This group swung back and forth between anarchistic ideas and individual ethical socialism and left social democratic positions. The reception of early socialist ideas is unmistakable: justice, ethical education for work, social ethic, camaraderie, and socialist living communities. Revolution, so as they generally argued, was possible at all times if the people only wanted it. Gustav Landauer was later active in this circle. On the history of German anarchism, see Erlich Linsen, bunch of German stuff. Next section. The Syndicalist Opposition. After the abolition of the socialist laws in 1890, Legion instituted a general commission for union activities. Previously, the activities of the half-legal unions were carried out by a network of shop stewards. After the Union Congress of 1892 in Halberstadt, large central organizations were created, whose existence, however, was dependent on the renunciation of political activity. Footnote. The central unions had approximately 340,000 members in 1891, approximately 2.5 million in 1914. End footnote. Already at this Congress, a minority voted for locally rooted organizations and for the right to engage in political activity. This minority was dubbed the Localists. Footnote: the Localists initially had approximately 10,000 members. Then the number declined slightly, and towards the end they again had approximately 17,000. They were made up in large part of the urban working class. They were strongest among construction workers, especially in Berlin. End of footnote. The Localists were led by the Regierungsbaumeister AD, Gustav Kessler. From 1897 on, their publicity organ was The Unity. Footnote: this newspaper was forbidden in 1914. End of footnote. Their demands aimed at the elimination of the separation of social democratic politics and union activities. The existence of tariff treaties and funds for economic support of workers were criticized as means of moderating the willingness to fight. In 1901, they renamed themselves the Free Alliance of German Unions. At the beginning of this conflict, the Social Democratic Party of Germany remained neutral, trying to reunite both wings of the Union movement. This changed, however, in the phase characterized by the mass strike debate. While the unions rejected the mass strike, the Localists supported it. Formally, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, influenced by August Bebel, also supported the mass strike. But the secret agreement between the union and the party leadership to prevent all mass strikes was publicized by the Localists. This was, however, for the Localists only a pyrrhic victory. In its wake, the quote Localists divided into anarchistic and social democratic factions. After Kessler's death, the anarcho-syndicalists under Friedeberg managed to gain the leadership. The division came over the question of syndicalism. Footnote: under Friedeberg's leadership, they fell back to a position of strict anti-parliamentarism and propagated the general strike as the starting point of the uprising. This in contrast to the social democratic understanding of the mass strike as an instrument of class struggle. Second footnote: the result of the argument between Kater and Friedeberg was that of the approximately 17,000 members, about 8,000 returned to the Central Union. A remainder of about 6,000 voted for Kater's syndicalism. Focal points of their political activity up to 1914 were anti-religious propaganda, enlightenment about pregnancy reduction from the perspective of proletarian Malthusianism, and anti-militarism. Operating in political proximity with them for a while during this time in the workers' movement, but increasingly critical, was Robert Michels. He too criticized the petit bourgeois character of the SPD and considered it a result of bureaucratization. Robert Michels' Law of Oligarchy focused on the Social Democratic Party. Discomfort about the bourgeois leaders became increasingly general especially as the socialist tribunes, August Bebel and Liebnik, moved into the background. In this period, the tendencies that develop in modern large organizations as movements of cooperation and hierarchy, that is, the same tendencies that critics viewed as subordination and accommodation to bourgeois stereotypes, became increasingly apparent. The Rosa Luxemburg faction. Rosa Luxemburg is one of the most important figures of revolutionary social democracy. In the struggle over the direction of social democracy should take, she chose, at the time, still with Kautsky's support, to combat Bernstein's revisionism. Her essay, Social Reform or Revolution, is devoted to this battle. Rosa Luxemburg's critique focuses on the notion that a new form of sociability, socialism, could be reached step by step. Rosa Luxemburg's critique focuses on the notion that a new form of sociability, socialism, could be reached step by step through reforms, and that therefore Marxist theory was now of only historical interest. She railed against Bernstein's concept that continuous growth of the unions and the Social Democratic Party would lead more or less automatically to socialism. She considered this idea to imply a mongrel hybrid between socialism and capitalism. In terms of the economic theory, she accused Bernstein of accepting only the guarantees of bourgeois economists. In short, Bernstein's undertaking was that of classical social democratic opportunism. In equal measure, she criticized the renunciation of reflection about the relation between theory and praxis. This critique was shared by most of the leftists, but in her attack on Bernstein, Rosa Luxemburg found a range of support from the Marxist center all the way through to the Bremen faction. In the mass strike debate, provoked by the strike movement at the beginning of the 20th century, above all, the Russian Revolution of 1905, the question of a revolutionary proletarian strategy was raised again, and Rosa Luxemburg took a middling position. On the one hand, she criticized the anarchistic identification of mass strike and general strike, while holding on to the form of this struggle because of the many contemporary occurrences of mass strikes, and thus, on the other hand, she criticized the leadership of the unions and the party to whom the independently active masses were an outrage. Against the background of the course of the Russian strike movement and of the political movement accompanying it, Rosa Luxemburg, as explicated in her essay on the mass strike, developed her specific understanding of theory and praxis. Rosa Luxemburg differentiated the forms of the strike into demonstration strikes, combat strikes, Kampfstreik, and mass strikes. For her, the mass strike was not only an economically motivated strike, the mass strike was above all a political weapon. Mass strikes, she replied to the anarchist syndicalists, do not happen for no reason. With this, she touched on the classical union position. Mass strikes have a different course. They are stormier and more intensive. The mass strike documents the creative form of expression of the experiences and needs of workers. The driving force here is the spontaneous. Sorry, there's a bunch of footnotes here, but they're all just citations. Oscar Knecht argues that Rosa Luxemburg's understanding of dialectics can be found in her conception of the mass movement, which is also the place of the proletarian public sphere. In contrast to the architects of the theory of spontaneity, of course, Luxemburg points towards the ambivalent role of spontaneity that may in one case be a driving force, in another a retarding force. Sorry, I was just looking to see if any of these footnotes were worth reading. There's like a million footnotes in this paper. Just as the focal point of the struggle can constantly change from an economic to political one, so too is the character of spontaneity to be viewed in relation to the process of becoming conscious of social relations. If in quiet times the division of labor between party and unions is sensible, it becomes in revolutionary periods an ideology, for in such times the unity of the economic and the political struggle is formed in real terms. In such periods, the separation of the economic and the political is transcended and they are fused. Footnote. The division between economic struggle and indirect forms of political struggle fall away in this period. Footnote. Another footnote. The economic and the political are no longer to be separated. Marx, too, had also pointed out the close relation between economic and political struggles with the example of the struggle over the reduction of the length of the working day. It was weird. I'm reading this on a PDF and fucking zoomed in so I could see the deepest corners of the letter S. This emerging unity has as its consequence a different form of organization, and this form cannot be decreed nor be determined in a technical voluntaristic manner. At a certain point, the mass strike becomes a people's movement. For this reason, it is injurious to the analysis of this movement to underestimate the potential of the unorganized workers, although social democracy is naturally the organized center of the working class. As social democracy is itself part of the movement, it must of course intervene and back the movement up tactically and supportively so that the movement is able to unfurl its full force. But it can only do this insofar as it spreads enlightenment about what it is that the masses are striving for. In this situation, the organization then appears as the quintessence, the product of such mass activity. Footnote. About the leadership, she wrote, quote, "The Social Democratic Party is the most enlightened and most class-conscious vanguard of the proletariat. It must, as always, be out in front of events, trying to accelerate events. Social democracy can do this by making the broadest layers of the proletariat understand the inevitability of entering into a revolutionary period and the most important social moments and political consequences of that period." End quote. In this situation, the organization then appears as the quintessence, the product of such mass activities. I think I already read that sentence. And a footnote anyway. The attempt to think the relation between organization and spontaneity as a dialectical, quote, dialectical democratic process also implies a different understanding of the idea of participating in traditional parliamentarism in order to have at least a controlling influence on the process of political power. This attempt is immediately embedded at the very root of the democratic process itself. The process of spontaneity and organization should be understood as a process of learning and experience. In quotes. In her view, this process of experience in practical democracy generates not only a proletarian public sphere, it also generates organization. It is, then, the process that generates the consciousness. It does so, the process generates consciousness in and through the practical and theoretical assertion of a class perspective that is conscious of its own transcendence as a class. The quote, self-knowledge of the proletariat, mediated through specific actions, contains political and economic experiences, and as Luxemburg sees it, these should lead to self-organization as well as to new organizational forms. In order to mediate theory and practice with one another, there needed to be the possibility of, quote, proletarian communication. It is this critical understanding that transports and mediates experience. It is also a process of self-communication and self-understanding. The initially separated dimensions of social reality, the economic struggle for distributional justice, and the state-oriented perspective of politics are only apparently independent, and their seeming separation will be recognized as illusion and mere appearance. And this is a practical as well as a theoretical process, about which a priori nothing can be said. As these experiences appear, however, briefly in historical moments, they need analysis and further development. That is, in turn, a theoretical and practical process. Social democrats of various positions belong to the circle of Rosa Luxemburg, although these persons worked in different departments of the workers' movement, like Clara Zetkin in women's issues, Franz Mehring in cultural matters, Karl Liebnik in the youth and peace movements. They were all able to come together to form a left. Thus, the alliance included people like Franz Mehring, Clara Zetkin, Karl Liebnik, but also Radek, so Karl Radek, I think his name is, and Karski, whose first name I don't know. In 1910, at the latest, the break between the left and the Social Democratic Party was complete when the party leadership refused an article by Rosa Luxemburg on the movement for the right to vote in Prussia. In their opposition to the war, the different factions came together one more time. Radical intellectuals: Julian Barchart, Heinrich Laufenberg, Karl Liebknecht, Franz Pfemfert, I'm assuming that's his name, and Fritz Wolfheim. In February 1911, Franz Pfemfert, now I don't know if that's how you pronounce his name, Pfemfert, so I'm saying Pfemfert, but no, that's how it's spelled, became the editor of Die Action. In Berlin, in which many authors to the left of center published their work, they had a diverse readership. Footnote: Rosa Luxemburg also published her most important later articles in Die Action. And also, the young Horkheimer was among Die Action's readership. The declared aim was to build the greater German left. Pfeffert's initiative was aimed above all at the organization of the, quote, intelligentsia. Die Action stood in solidarity with Rosa Luxemburg, but already very early on preferred organizational independence vis-a-vis the Social Democratic Party. Along with Otto Rühle, Pfeffert opted for a new Syndicalist Workers' Party, in quotes. In September 1913, Julian Borchardt became editor of Lichtstrahlen. Julian Borchardt, too, voted after 1914 for an independent opposition, quote, independent oppositional workers' party, end quote. And worked within the context of the Internationalen Sozialisten Deutschlands. Heinrich Laufenberg, who came to the SPD from the Catholic Center Party, and Franz Möhring suggested that he go to Hamburg to write a history of the workers' movement. Heinrich Laufenberg was excluded from the party in 1912 because of his leftist demands. He played a large role in the leftist factions in Hamburg during the war. Theoretically, he was more critical of the notion of spontaneity than other contemporaries. Together with Fritz Wolfheim, he became one of the representatives of the left wing of the German Communist Party after the war. Later, he briefly played a role in the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, the KAPD, until he and Wolfheim were both excluded as representatives of German National Bolshevism. Karl Liebnik, a well-known lawyer, tried before the war to organize the youth movement of the Social Democratic Party as well as the anti-militarist movement. Karl Liebnik advocated an ethical socialist position that after the outbreak of the war quickly led him and Pfeffert to a rejection of the war credits. Karl Liebknik's work in the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany and the Spartacusbund made him, next to Rosa Luxemburg, one of the leaders of the young communist movement. The Bremen Radicals, Anton Pannekoek, Neef, and Hermann Gorter. After Rosa Luxemburg, the most significant theoretician of left social democracy before 1914 was doubtless the astronomer Anton Pannekoek. Recommended by Franz Möhring for the party school of the Social Democratic Party, he taught there from 1905 onwards. With Hermann Gorter and Henriette Roland Holst, theoretical elements of the radical opposition of the Dutch Democratic Party were enunciated. Beginning in 1907, Anton Pannekoek published the Socialist Opposition paper, De Tribune. With the founding of the SDP, which I think is the Socialist Democratic Party of the Netherlands, in 1909 he distanced himself from social democracy. The political and theoretical influence of Pannekoek's writings reached the Bremen Burger Zeitung under the editorship of Johannes Neef and the Bremen Arbeiterpolitik, and also the Bremen and Hamburg left. The focal point of his writings was the mass strike. Anton Pannekoek's opposition to traditional versions became clear in the polemic between him and Karl Kautsky. Kautsky insisted that the interests of the organized and unorganized masses were not the same, and he accused the leftist of political encroachment. Pannekoek, in contrast, emphasized that decisive power lay beyond Parliament, and he accused Karl Kautsky of having a, quote, too mechanistic conception of the organization, end quote, of identifying organization with institutions, and of being afraid of revolution. The basis of organization is rather a different, more voluntary one, and thus the party must be understood as only one part of the, quote, power of the masses for action, end quote. Summarizing Pannekoek's position on the question of organization, Bach writes, quote, the basis of understanding organization is the voluntary discipline of the masses in action with unlimited freedom of discussion, end quote. This thesis rests on the notion that the economy has direct causal efficacy and causes the masses to react. End footnote. Nevertheless, the party should assume leadership. The mass strike towards which this movement is heading will only occur on the basis of proletarian power. Organization, as Bach makes clear, was for Pannekoek determined by the, quote, spirit of belonging, end quote. Footnote. The Communist Workers' Party of Germany later based itself systematically on Dietzkin's writings that were popularized by Henriette Roland Host. As Bach shows, Pannekoek, who followed her efforts, remarked to Dietzkin, quote, Marx showed the efficacy of the world, society, and the economy by showing how they affect people and offer them a certain content. Dietzkin, showed the efficacy of mind itself by giving this content a particular form. Pure neo-idealism. End footnote. Marx's theory must be made complete by inclusion of the subjective factor. Footnote. Bach interprets this in agreement with Lenk as an anticipation of the position of Lukács and Korsch that Lukács and Korsch later adopted. Despite the differences, Pannekoek's similarities with the syndicalist position are obvious. Subjective morality reappears here as the mere will towards revolution. The First World War. Not immediately, though in due course, the First World War and the politics of civil peace brought the various factions of the opposition together. This began with the refusal of Karl Liebnik and Otto Rühl to vote for the war credits. By the end of 1915, there were already 15 Reichstag representatives who voted against the credits. The group organized itself first as the Social Demokratischen Arbeitsgemeinschaft, and then as the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany. In 1916, the founding of the Spartacus-Bund followed in order to provide opposition to the power politics of the majority of the Social Democratic Party. Footnote. The Social Democratic Party majority allowed the offices of the centrist paper Vorwärts to be occupied and the editorial board dispersed by military authorities. End footnote. The Arbeitsgemeinschaft included the leftist, the earlier Marxist center, the Haas faction, Ledebor, and some of the reformists. This group was unified by opposition to the war. There were various notions of organization, from the Independent Social Democratic Party, the Spartacus Bund, and the Bremen leftist. Excuse me. The USPD organized itself according to the adoption of moderately decentralizing elements. The Spartacus Bund represented a moderate centralism in the context of a revolutionary international, but rejected the conspiratorial activities. The decentralizing tendencies were rejected. The Bremen and Hamburg left cooperated early on with the Zimmerwald movement and then opted against the, quote, social democratization of the Independent Social Democratic Party and the Spartacus Bund. Increasingly, they understood themselves as part of the Zimmerwald left, with Lenin as their spokesman. The revolutionary period. The revolutions of 1917 strengthened the revolutionary tendencies in Europe. Footnote: a study that proves to be an implicitly apologetic interpretation of the developments in Russia is that of Rainer Rotermund. This work repeats the thesis of the belated development of Russia and the needs for the Soviet Union to catch up with the West, as well as the thesis of the Soviet Union as, quote, a really existing substitute for socialism. And a footnote. In this context, the economic Caesura, S-C-A-E-S-U-R-A, whatever that word means, seemed to be a break with the past, a new time. Footnote: a new approach appeared to have begun, that which Marx had written about the industrial pirates proved itself to be the stronger law. Concerning the general concentration of capital, Santa Maria and Manville maintain, quote, the result of the abolition of capital within the boundaries of the capitalist mode of production is itself only a formal opposition. Marx shows that this abolition is an imposed force, a historical form of the manifestation of capital. The form based on private property is abolished, but not the relation itself. End footnote. The period before the war had already been perceived by many contemporaries to be a period of crisis. Contributing to this perception were not only the politico-militaristic chest-beating of the European leaders, but also the signs of a serious economic crisis. The World War accelerated the decline of the economy. The Russian Revolution signaled not only the end of the First World War, but also the end of traditional power. Revolution, economic crisis, and political crisis were thus interpreted as a unity and perceived as a historical break. Because the protagonist of this study saw in socialism an alternative, the year 1917 seemed to be an epochal break, the beginning of a new era of socialism. After the strikes at the end of the war, the foundation of the Communist Party was accomplished. This encompassed three factions, one that aimed at a unification with the independent Social Democratic Party, one that followed a strategy oriented towards the masses, including Luxemburg, and the Bremen, Hamburg, and Berlin leftists, who pushed the strongest for a Republic of Workers' Councils or Soviets. The leftists were accused of, quote, syndicalism and were forced out of the Communist Party of Germany by Paul Levi. The left then organized themselves into the Communist Workers' Party of Germany, the KAPD. Footnote: though the federalist principle could not be established in the Communist Party of Germany, especially after Liebnik's death, it remained the programmatic center point of left communism. They then organized themselves in blah, blah. End of footnote. This new party proved to be divided into three wings: the National Bolshevist, a syndicalist wing renouncing politics, and an authentic left communist wing. The high point of the Communist Workers' Party of Germany was a period from 1918 to 1924. It then collapsed, having splintered several times. Part of the KAPD's membership returned to the Social Democratic Party, while others worked on in small groups. The critique of Bolshevism. Early on, a clear profile of anti-Leninist notions of organization had developed. The critique of Lenin was then extended to his philosophy. Footnote: for example, Anton Pannekoek's Lenin as Philosopher. The focal point of left political thinking remained the Soviet. End of footnote. The focal point of left political thinking remained the Soviet or Council movement. Similar notions can also be found in Italy during this period. The critique of Bolshevism became general. The theses on Bolshevism by the Group of International Communists of Holland begin with praise of Lenin for his struggle against the war and for having decisively led the Russian Revolution. Concerning the discussion of the prerequisites of the Russian Revolution, the theses based its interpretation on the following. Russian history had been determined by two opposing forces, lying geographically between Europe and Asia, and with a political economy caught between feudalism and capitalism. Footnote: Russian feudalism is generally considered a form of rule analogous to that of feudalism in the West. This analogy, however, ignores the particular structure of the Russian bureaucratic nobility after the Petrine reforms. And the other footnote: there were only a few initiatives to develop capitalist agriculture. These resulted, however, only in the destruction of the Russia village communes, which brought great immiseration in its wake. The uniqueness of the Russian conditions, of course, remains uncomprehended in this mechanistic interpretation, which transposed in schematic fashion Western structures onto Russia. Did I say end of footnote? Well, anyway, I'm not reading footnote anymore. For that reason, the following theses are also problematic, although their details are partially based on correct facts. Russia of the late 19th century was seen to have been based on an equilibrium between the propertied classes and faced the task of industrialization. For this reason, a certain form of bourgeois revolution was due. The theses argued that this situation could to a certain degree be compared with that of pre-revolutionary France. The decisive difference is seen by the theses, especially in the fact that the classes were ambivalent in their interests. On the one hand, they should feel as opponents of Tsarism, with which, however, they cooperated on the other hand. However, while the Russian nobility attempted before 1917 to extend its influence over the absolutist state, the bourgeoisie was weak and dependent on Tsarism and ultimately signed on to the program of, quote, reforming Tsarism. The Russian peasantry was petit bourgeois and depended on alliances with other social groups. Later, in the phase of struggle in 1917, it is alleged that the peasantry became counter-revolutionary. Nevertheless, the peasantry is seen to have helped secure the victory of the revolution by having represented their own interests against the large landholders. The Russian proletariat, on the other hand, even though numerically small, is said to have developed a huge readiness to fight. Finally, the petit bourgeois intelligentsia, the Jacobins, had to put its stamp on the revolution. The Russian Revolution supposedly occurred within this class triangle: Tsarism, feudalism, bourgeois against peasants and proletariat. And because the peasants were too dependent on the worker and the workers too few, Bolshevism is seen to have entered the picture as a substitute. Bolshevism is seen to bear, quote, all the essential tendencies of the revolutionary bourgeois politics, end quote, plus the Marxist, quote, insight into the laws of the movement of classes, end quote. Bolshevism is deemed to be the revolutionary social democrat, quote, the Jacobin in alliance with the masses, end quote, Lenin. In short, it is to be compared with the revolutionary petite bourgeoisie of the French Revolution. This is seen to be most apparent in its politics and organization, mobilization and seizure of power by means of a centralized organization. Theoretically, Lenin's theory was seen to have been hitched onto bourgeois materialism, which did not prevent a quote, sliding back into philosophical idealism, end quote. Insofar as Bolshevik politics were aimed against Russian absolutism, it was seen to be justified. In terms of the groups who were bearing the alliance against Tsarism, Bolshevik politics were instrumental. This instrumentalism, it was emphasized, also has a theoretical side concerning its relation to Marxism. At this point, it becomes clear that the critique delivered in the thesis is developed from the perspective of the critique of Stalinism. The emphasis on the quote, People's Revolution is seen to reveal that the Russian Revolution was a bourgeois revolution, the masses under bourgeois leadership. Against this background, the slogans about the workers' councils are seen to be merely tactical. The council model was in fact abandoned as the Bolsheviks found other means to carry out their struggle against the social revolutionaries. There's a footnote citing Oscar Anweiler's The I think it's called The Councils in the Russian Revolution. I just bought the book, so maybe I'll read that sometime. The end of the council model was at Kronstadt. From Kronstadt on, the idea of a democracy of workers' councils was only represented by the worker opposition, which brought about only its own persecution. In contrast to the usual division of the events of 1917 into first a bourgeois, then a proletarian revolution, the theses argue that the whole period should be considered a fundamental and unitary process of social restructuring, a process that began with the collapse of Tsarism and that can be characterized as a bourgeois revolutionary process. The old power triangle, Tsarism, feudal nobility, bourgeoisie, was dissolved by the new one, Bolshevism, peasantry, working class. Footnote. Quote, this is a quote from the Theses on Bolshevism, Thesis 34. Just as the Tsarist state apparatus ruled autonomously over both property-owning classes, so too did the new Bolshevik state apparatus begin to gain autonomy from the two classes on which the Bolshevik state apparatus was based. End of footnote. The revolution was considered a Blankist one, and transposed elements of, quote, politics of Jacobin conspiracy, end quote, of a bourgeois revolution against the bourgeoisie. After the revolution, the bourgeois element clearly focused on industrial politics. But the issue was not socialization, but, quote, control of capitalist production by the workers. Not socialism, but state economy. Thus, Bolshevism was considered to be above all a, quote, dictatorial leadership of the Jacobin intelligentsia, end quote, and as such the modern form of bourgeois revolution. In this respect, it was also considered to be the largest obstacle to proletarian struggle. Analytical moments similar to those of the Council Communists are to be found in Lukács and especially Karl Korsch. While Lukács begins history and class consciousness with subjectively oriented elements and ends up in accommodation with Leninism, Karl Korsch's critique of Lenin after his break with the Communist Party of Germany was more fundamental. The focal point of Korsch's critique consists of questions of epistemology and notions of practice. In this regard, that he is clear that he is much closer to the left communists. All right, there's a whole bunch of footnotes here. So, let's dive in. Footnote 1. The Lukács in question here is the political Lukács. His significance as a social theorist and philosopher is disproportionately greater. His theoretical work concentrated on society, reification, fetishism, and knowledge. These issues must be treated elsewhere. The next footnote. Lukács was concerned here with the limits on what could still be said in the KP, Communist Party. This forced him to make many changes of direction, self-criticisms, and recantations. And the final footnote. Lenin's philosophy, it's just a reference to Karl Korsch's Lenin's philosophy. And it says that Korsch's critique speaks of Kautsky, but it is aimed at Lenin. Okay, end of footnotes. On to the next section. Dilemmas of left politics. The dilemma of left politics in the 1920s can be described as follows. The general politics of the Communist Party of Germany is characterized by its accommodations with Russian relations and politics. Because several different factions were involved, these politics were at times not successful. Eventually, the Bolshevization of the party was accomplished, even if it remained an open question as to what that meant in specific historical situations. An opposition movement in the style of the left opposition to Lenin, like that of Fischer and Maslow, who later formed the Lenin Bund, did not go beyond this framework. 2. In view of the rise of fascist movements and parties, the politics of the Communist Party opposition aimed at a closer cooperation with the Social Democratic Party and the unions. Ernest Thalheimer, I think it's Ernest, just says Thalheimer, but trying to test my memory. Thalheimer's analysis, known as the Bonapartism thesis, end quote, studied the social situation against the background of fascist movements. These attempts were mostly torpedoed by the central organizations of the party. The shortcomings of this politics was obvious. It was oriented towards short-term cooperation and information, but largely had to accept the undertakings of social democratic politics in the party and unions, and it had a close pragmatic relationship to social conflicts. Footnote. It's just a citation. Three, the Syndicalist Orientation had some influence in and outside of the unions. Its Federalist program was partially accepted in many parties to the left of the Communist Party. Similarly, the politics of left communism had some influence periodically. As a democratic and federalist group that was oriented towards workers' councils and that concentrated on the working class, it formulated, partially through its critique of Lenin, various perspectives beyond day-to-day politics. The demand for, quote, a pure proletariat, end quote, though itself not without prognostic value, contradicted, however, not only the premises of spontaneity theory, but also the insight adopted from syndicalism and social anarchism that the revolution is possible at all times. That is, it depends solely on the will of the actors. As clear as it is as its perspective on revolution was, its concept of revolution was equally unclear. From a theoretical perspective, however, questions were raised that led to attempts to connect to a new conceptualization of experience, which posited a different conception of revolution. Next section. After the war. After the war, as a consequence of National Socialist and Stalinist politics, all communist groups found themselves marginalized once again. This remains true even though several groups were able to carve out positions of local significance. German left communism seems to have emigrated to the United States. Footnote. The KPO and Bremen, among others, were still alive and kicking. And for example, it cites the left communism moving to the United States, he cites Paul Maddock. Several earlier followers, however, hibernated in various university cities and exercised some influence in the SDS, the German Socialist German Student Union, that formed an independent organization in 1959 to 60, namely in Berlin, Frankfurt, Gießen, Göttingen, and Stuttgart. It was therefore not surprising that in the wake of the struggle associated with 1968, and in the wake of the Maoist and Soviet re-dogmatizing of political discussion, the idea of the council movement emerged once again, though articulated somewhat naively as opposition. In the course of these re-emerging discussions, classical anarchism became marginalized because of classical anarchism's bourgeois individualistic forms were again revealed, and it was therefore conceptualized as a faction of liberalism. The own history of council communism, however, the tradition of council communism was wholly inadequately studied. This was reversed for only a very few. Okay, there's a bunch of footnotes here. Bourdieu's influence was first recognized in the German discussion, though generally without any critical evaluation. The critique of the tradition of council communism being adequately studied was reserved for only a few. That's what the Bourdieu citation is in reference to. Okay. End of footnote. The collapse of the Soviet Union had to some degree opened the possibility for a new debate and new politics. The aura that had surrounded Lenin's politics has dissipated. The fragile foundations of Soviet politics has become obvious. Even if one follows the findings that Lenin's politics follow a bourgeois notion of revolution, the memory remains of constellations that opened possibilities, even though many, for a number of internal and external reasons, were not realized. Two moments immediately spring to mind: internationalism and the conception of the economic. A specific international constellation made the bourgeois revolution possible. A social international constellation made the Russian Revolution possible. But it was only possible because it conceived of itself both as a movement against the war and as an international movement. The demand of a proletarian internationalism became universal. A demand that, cautiously formulated, is already found in the writings of the First International. But in post-1917 politics, internationalism was not pursued in real terms. For this reason, internationalizing the workers' movement is still a fundamental task. Lenin's understanding of the economy has been widely discussed, yet a fundamental understanding and critique of the capitalist economy cannot be found in Lenin. If an understanding of economic forms cannot be offered in dogmatic terms, then one must confront the question of what indeed is meant by a capitalist economy. What makes the economy capitalistic? This leads to further questions as to how to overcome it. In this regard, it is necessary to problematize the relation between the political and the social, and to explain how they are bound together in the economic sphere. This conceptualization cannot be made from the outside. One has to stand in the things in order to understand. This conceptualization cannot be made from the outside. One has to stand in the things in order to understand, and through the understanding to criticize them. It would therefore be of great value to remind ourselves again of Rosa Luxemburg's concept of experience and its further elaborations, and to reapply and renew it as a topic for critical thought and reflection. This essay has been translated from German by Joseph Fraccia.